Hey, welcome back to Mike Reads the World. Today I'll be discussing Anton de Kam's We Slaves of Suriname for the country of Suriname. Anton de Kam is a very important figure in Dutch and Surinamese history. It says on the back, in June of 2020, he was actually added to the Dutch National Core Curriculum for History Education, the canon of the Netherlands, because of his central role in opposing racism and colonialism. And this is way more than just a typical history of slavery. And it barely really gets into racism or colonialism at all. This book treats the essential problem of slavery and the aftermath and its legacy in the country of Suriname, from the beginning of the colonial era up to his present day when he was writing this, which was the 1930s, and most of the world was going through a Great Depression, and there was political upheaval and so on. And he was looked at as a communist, put in prison, and then exiled from his own country, where then when World War II broke out, he joined the Dutch resistance against the Germans, and then he was arrested by the Germans and sent to a concentration camp where he died in 1945. So quite an incredible and tragic but powerful life that Anton de Kam lived, and Suriname's National University is named after him. And he was the son of a man who was born a slave, by the way. So he is writing with some personal and passionate senses here. And this book, it's 150 pages of direct to the heart, sometimes acidic humor, sarcasm, pointing out the contradictions of the ways that slavery has been justified and the hypocrisies of the ways that it was implemented. And but the book, I went into this book a little bit like, oh, do I really have to read this? I know I'm against slavery, and it's like, I know it's going to be hard to stomach. And it wasn't something I was going in like looking forward to reading, but the translation is incredible, and it's delivered with such personal and poetic and at times and passionate prose that I found it actually to be easy to understand and I guess as easy to process as something like this can be. It really, I think the fact that it's from, mainly the perspective of those who were enslaved and never for 1 second loses sight of their humanity in all of this, starting from being put on the market and branded with symbols, to those escaped outcasts who ran off into the rainforests of Suriname. Some of the most exciting and I suppose hopeful or invigorating parts of the books were about those outcasts who escaped slavery, formed their own societies or villages in the rainforest, and fought against the colonial powers and helped other escaped slaves as well. So you kind of had this whole, alongside this horrible history of punishments and cruelty. I mean, you get stuff in here that's, the truth is stranger than fiction, because I was down to 2 books for Suriname. One was a fictional account by a woman that also was about slavery. But I said, I'm going to go with the classic work of the country, the one that, it cites sources, it gives you the cold, hard truth. But that truth is, I feel, stranger than almost any fiction could be. We get stories of basically slave owning, the woman or the wife of a slave owning man, however you want to think of that, who was basically a serial killer. They found just a bunch of dead slaves in her house, and just horrifying stuff like this. And that's a very extreme example, obviously, but it's like there's no part of this that is justifiable at all. You look at it up and down, and he gives you some of the most extreme examples, and he even addresses that in some parts of the book. I really made the mistake of this one of not sort of marking things that I wanted to read, but like here's an example though of some of like the acidic humor, I suppose. A good salesman always sees to it that his wares look their best before putting them on the market, and whatever the Dutchmen lacked in humanity, they were always good salesmen. We must grant them that. And then later, there is no denying it, the Dutch are good merchants. And why wouldn't they increase their profits by exploiting the natural properties with which God happened to endow human beings, even those in black skins? They're discussing that families were specifically separated into separate lots because they knew that they knew that slaves don't tend to last as long. It's so horrifying even saying this stuff out loud. I'm sorry, like ugh. So that people would buy more lots, basically, without giving you all the details. It's so horrifying. And here's the thing, like this stuff has been with us since the beginning of human history, right? That we know of, and but we've known it's wrong. Otherwise, we wouldn't have stories of like Moses leading the slaves out of Egypt, or like in the Conference of the Birds, which was written in medieval Persia, where in many of the parables, slavery is written about it if it's a fact of life. Like the king has his slave boys and stuff like that. But at the same time, in this Conference of the Birds, at the end of the book, the sins of the birds. Check out my video on this work of poetry, by the way, if you're interested. It's really incredible. At the end of the book, the birds their sins are analogous to the brothers of Joseph, the biblical story of Joseph, his brothers who sold him into slavery. So there's the sense throughout the history of literature that it's dehumanizing, that it's evil, that it is wrong. And yet it's with us, and we live now in like pretty much the only period of human history that we know of where it's like that it basically has been completely eradicated. But it also makes you think, as I'm reading this, the thought that it really brought up is that there are rich and well, I don't want to just single out the rich, but there are powerful, there are people with political and financial power in this world who I believe that if the law and society were to gradually or suddenly make it okay for people to work without pay and be basically the property of another human being, there are people with political and financial power that would not have any moral qualms about returning to that state of the world. And it saddens me, and it didn't really hit me until reading this book that I'm still hearing just among average people like that crazy justifications of slavery, like saying like, well, not all slave owners treated their slaves that bad, and some of them even returned to their masters. It's like I don't even want to get into it. I just can't even bring myself to start arguing. But it's like just stop. I mean. And then there's people that think, for example, that seem to think that it wasn't worth having a war to eliminate this institution in our country. So in the United States, which again to me is just crazy. I mean, just really read this and put yourself in the shoes of those human beings. I mean, that if you have any notion, and I don't know who I'm talking to here, probably everyone who watches this channel is cool, and I don't need to say this, but in preaching to the choir, but it's like if there is any notion in your brain that slavery is like a justifiable and thing that we don't need to constantly be making sure that it doesn't come back, read this book. Okay? It's impossible to go a political direction in your head with this because Anton de Kom did. He was at the end of his life involved in the labor movements in his country and got exiled for it and imprisoned, and they called him a communist, and there were all these witch hunts. There's another thing I'm sure could be coming back any day now, the communist witch hunts. And that's the thing, it's like, now, I understand that, from what I understand, like if you read Gulag Archipelago and Master and Margarita, we see that in in communist Russia, there existed certain conditions that you could call basically slavery. And but I also want to point out that something not far off also existed under capitalism, and in this sort of and there's many times throughout this book that Anton de Kam points out that that the government had a very heavy hand in making sure that certain elites were benefited by any economic decision. So that's a bit later in the book when it talks about the banana plantations, the United Fruit Company deal, where they were basically trying to introduce massive agricultural projects of bananas into the country. They also tried it with rubber. There were basically all of these massive programs to introduce industrial agriculture into the country that had failed, up to the point that Anton de Kam was writing this, and he reiterates over and over in the book that it's small agricultural plots, small farmers, to mid-sized farmers that need to be supported. The very people that were liberated, the liberated slaves, those were the ones that, or the liberated people that were slaves, those are the people that need to be supported with credit or anything like that. But by the end of the book, he just said, you know what, a little bit of credit or a little bit of this or that, it's not going to do any good. Organized labor unions are pretty much the only way forward, is the conclusion he comes to. A very similar conclusion reached in working classes around the world during the Great Depression era. The United States, from what I understand, was one of those as well. So it's kind of impossible to start thinking a little bit politically while reading this book and thinking about labor and how not, you can take this beyond just the racialized aspect of it. And that's what I like about this book, is that Anton de Kam does. He's analyzing here the racialization of it is all tied up in it, but he's really analyzing the institution as a whole. And he also highlights the fact that the outlaws, the escaped slaves, treat any captured like Dutch women or children with respect, whereas the slaves don't really get the same. The slaves get harsh treatment if they are caught after having escaped. Mostly they're executed. So this is a tough book to talk about, if you can't tell, for a lot of reasons. And I really wish that I had marked a few more things that I wanted to talk about. Here's one thing I wanted to highlight. The old justification of slavery that he very eloquently debunks. Europe's institutions of higher learning teach that the Greek temples were built by slaves, that the whole astonishing culture with its sublime philosophical and poetic creations, its marvelous paintings and sculptures, its plays, music, and dance could exist only because an army of slaves gave its rulers the opportunity to be civilized and free. We leave to professional scholars the question of whether this thesis is correct, or whether, when the Greeks began importing slaves, which required a certain prior level of power and wealth, it marked the beginning of the decline of a culture where exalted principles were irreconcilable with the unjust practice of slavery. So, he goes on and says, we are entitled to ask this question of you, people of the Netherlands. If slavery is the foundation of culture, what temples have you built in Suriname? What poems have you written? What lofty ideas have you handed down to posterity? Wouldn't you be at a loss if you had to erect even one single statue in Suriname for Dutch colonists famed for their intellectual achievements? That's a pretty fair question. Because the reality is that in most modern countries during the the age of, I guess, between 1600 and 1900, let's say, we didn't see high culture and monuments and great lasting works of art or civilization or philosophy being produced as a result of slavery. I'm sure there's people, and this is part again. Why is it important to read this? Why is it important to read this? Any principles that philosophy, which is supposed to be about, figuring out how to live life, right? Any principles that such a pursuit can lead us to are going to be nullified and totally irreconcilable with the institution of slavery. And if we are striving to be higher beings and be something more than our kind of basic nature, I suppose. But that's even a strange thing to say because the institution is rather unnatural. So I don't know. I don't know what I'm saying, but basically there's I don't know who this book is for. I've done my best to kind of speak about everything it covers, everything it made me think about. I guess I didn't really finish my thought about the what I was saying about books like Gulag Archipelago and Master and Margarita. I feel like there's a certain kind of person who might look at this book and say, oh, it's now part of the Dutch national core curriculum, like woke BS, or maybe not that far. They might just say like, oh, this isn't worth reading because it's not great literature. It's not in the great Western canon, and it's something that I already know I'm against. I don't need to be preached at that slavery is bad. Okay. But these same people turn around and will call Gulag Archipelago and Master and Margarita these great classics of world literature. So, that's why I read the world personally, because the canon is deceptive. To a certain point, I do believe in the canon. I like my classic works of literature, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And Anton de Kam's We Slaves of Suriname is an excellent example of why we should be reading outside the canon as well. So, but I mean, you can do whatever you want. So, next time on Mike Reads the World, we are going to look at another author that I've already read something from, I believe. So I'm going to be I think I'm going to be continuing alternating, between a new country, a country I've already read, but an additional book by an author I like or that I'm curious about, and then a poetry video. So we're going to be kind of alternating back and forth on those. I feel like I could have done a better job with this video and this book, and that I've said things that might alienate some people, but I think pretty good at heart with what I've said, even if I've left some things out. So take care, and we'll see you next time on Mike Reads the World.